All right, welcome everybody to the Monday, October 24th meeting of SIG Service Catalog. Today, I want the discussion to be around the remaining time before the face-to-face meeting in Boulder next week and how to take best advantage of that time. So let me kick that discussion off by breaking down the things that this SIG is going to do into different swim lanes. The first swim lane is like, what is the service catalog supposed to do? What are the user stories and use cases around it? The second is, what is the API going to look like, and what patterns are there in upstream that are convenient to reuse, appropriate to reuse, what precedents are there that we need to adhere to? And then later on, what does the API look like? And then the third swim lane is, where does this API live? How does it how do you run it as an operator, and how do you federate it with the main API, and concerns around like more architecture of the work product that we eventually produce. So I would like to focus in the remaining time before the face-to-face on the requirements swim lane, because it will work best if when we're speaking to one another in Boulder, that we all have a shared vision for what is this thing supposed to do, and what is the experience like as a user going to be. So with that in mind, Seth, I see you're on the call. I wonder if you would talk for a bit about the agenda that we composed for the meeting next week.
The agenda. Actually, Kent, have you looked at it yet?
I have looked at it, but not recently. It was Aaron who put the agenda together, and last I looked at it, I agreed with what was.
Yeah, so the reason why I was trying to connect you, Kent, is because Paul and I talked a little bit about. So let me step back, and I'll begin to show some of my age too, and consistency of jumping ahead and all over the place. So Aaron and Paul started with an agenda, which was like, here are the specifics of what we want to get done, and Paul and I talked about basically what he just reviewed, the 3 swim types of work. So Paul, I'm not really sure what you're looking to get out of me, because I feel like you took it over and did pretty well there. And I think you're muted.
I am muted. You are correct. So mostly I was looking for what we talked about for deliverables, and I can just go through them. I mean, I think they boiled down to exit criteria for that meeting being ideally that we have a use case document and a user story that articulates in non-technical terms what it's like to use the catalog, what are the things that the catalog does, and what integrations are we expecting with the catalog and backend APIs. So the second swim lane, the API, what does it look like? We had talked about manufacturing consensus on what nouns are in the API, and what are the relationships between them. So that would be things like, presumably we'll have a resource for a service in the proposal from DAIS. It's called service class. What does that thing look like? What are the relationships between that noun and the other nouns in the API? And I think we decided that probably it was a reach to have a goal in the third swim lane, but we did talk about having some kind of rough consensus around what does the deployment topology of a catalog alongside a normal Kubernetes cluster look like. Does anybody think that there are things that are missing from that those sets of goals, or that set of goals falls short? I'm reading a no from the group since nobody's saying anything. If that's the case, then I would like to talk use cases today and user stories. I don't know if anybody has seen this, but there is a pull request, which I'm going to add a link to in the agenda document. By the way, I'll put a link to the agenda document into the chat. So Jay from Google has added a pull request for a user story, like an actual creative writing type user story. Jay's not here, so I don't think that this is the best time to dive into that, but I want to share it with all of you. Excuse me, so that that we can all start looking at this. I'm going to add a link into the.
Actually, Paul, before we move on, can we talk a little bit more about Boulder?
Sure.
Just kind of. I'll turn video on. What are you expecting like everyone to bring to the table for the meeting? Just so we know what to kind of work on for next week. So we can work on use cases for our side. We can work on prototyping some stuff. We can work on putting together some architectural proposals. What do you think would be sort of the best use of time between now and next week?
I think the best use of time between now and next week is if we can ensure that the use cases file in the incubator repo is as close to complete for what we want the scope of the V1 deliverable to be. And I wanted to spend some time in this meeting today just going through that. It's nowhere near complete, but I wanted the group to call out at a high level what's missing from that document. And then I'm interested in folks volunteering to write up use cases and make pull requests to the incubator repo to populate that document in advance of next week. And this is probably a good time to mention that I think it would be great if the group could meet this week on on Wednesday and Friday as well. Maybe not for an hour, but for half an hour, so that the takeaways from this meeting we can discuss before Monday of next week, so that we can try to make some progress in advance of next week. What's the temperature of the group with regard to some additional meetings this week? Not mandatory, but optional. And if you agree to write up a use case, please come. I saw a thumbs up from Weston. I see an enormous thumb from Jason. And an okay from Doug. So I don't hear any no's. We'll consider that adopted. Let me record that in the minutes today. Okay. So let me load up the use case document, and I will share my screen. And now I am confused by the dialogue where I share my screen, so bear with me. All right. So can you folks all see my browser window now?
It's a negative.
Okay. It helps if you click the share screen button. All right. How about now?
That's good.
All right. Awesome. Okay, so let me call out before we dive into this thing that it's nowhere near complete. I think myself and Doug have been the folks contributing to this so far. I want to get some more people from the group involved, but with those things in mind, let me just dive into this thing. So it's divided into two sections. There's a high-level use cases, and then there's a lower level, what are the use cases for integrating with the Cloud Foundry Service Broker API? If there are other use cases that aren't captured, like another back-end integration that we want to add, I'm totally fine adding another section to be a sibling to like the Cloud Foundry Service Broker use cases, but that's the current layout of this document. Just going over the high-level ones quickly, obviously they're nowhere near complete because the only two that are on here are sharing black box services via the Cloud Foundry Service Broker API. And you'll notice that this document is very skewed toward that API. I'm happy to clean that up because that is not the single focus, but I think it's a good lens to talk about this problem through. So the two use cases are, as a SaaS provider that already runs a service broker, I want users of Kubernetes to be able to use my service broker via that same API so that I can include my user base, or I can grow my user base to include users of Kubernetes. The second one is, as the operator of an existing service in Kubernetes, I want to be able to publish that service via that API so that I can participate in that ecosystem. I can share my service across namespaces in Kubernetes, et cetera, et cetera. Obviously, this is a very sparse list. Anybody, feel free to call out what's missing, and we can make a note of that and turn that into a takeaway for somebody to write up a use case.
I would like to ask just a general question of what's the kind of the temperature between supporting only black box services or supporting white box and black box services, or the scenario of sort of gray box, which is like deploying into my cluster but not being able to see the underlying resources behind those things?
So my own opinion on that subject is that I think black box is a no-brainer. I think that there's probably a lot of interest around white box. But I think when we get into white box, there's probably a significant expansion of the scope. So I'm totally fine talking about white box. One of the challenges might be avoiding being too prescriptive about white box so that we can have white box implementations from a variety of contributors. Doug, I see that you have raised your hand. Let me call on you.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I would just prefer to start with black box. I don't want to necessarily preclude white box or gray box later on. I just think black box is probably the easiest baby step to tackle. So I prefer to start with that.
Okay.
Yeah, let me just jump in and say, I mean, I think that I certainly agree with that. And I think that we should strive to have a model that is extensible in such a way that adding white box later, has a rational path.
Yeah, I think that so one of the things that I really like about the Cloud Foundry Service Broker API, it's not perfect by any means, but I think that the nouns in that API are factored well enough that if we abstract out the meaning of them, I think that we'll find they're pretty good at describing the problem space. And I think that we could probably talk through making use cases that cover what that API covers, and that probably gives us a pretty good basis to add white box on top of. Does anybody disagree with that?
Nope, sounds good to me.
Okay. Shall we say, for the purposes of discussion, since we only have 40 minutes remaining, that we'll focus on black box for now?
Hey, Paul, let me just ask you a question. Has this group, I don't know what happened last week, if we've shared with the group some of the progress that's been made in the working group for the service broker with the Cloud Foundry folks? Is that something that you would want to just bring people up to speed on, or is it too early?
I'm happy to talk about it. Anybody can jump in who participates in that working group if they think that I've missed anything. But basically, the last 2 working group meetings have been around governance of the API and talking about where is the thing going to live. I think where we ended the last meeting is that there's going to be a neutral GitHub repository created. I think the name that they settled on was Open Service Broker. Don't quote me on that. I'll have to go back and look. But the main takeaway is that the naming and artifacts associated with that API are going to become more neutral than they currently are. Currently, it's a Cloud Foundry product or Cloud Foundry API, and it's going to become the Open Service Broker API, and we'll have a neutral Slack organization, neutral mailing list for that. Does that kind of encompass your understanding, Martin?
Yeah, that's right. I just wanted people to sort of understand that this is really becoming its own standalone thing, and so it's not that we're supporting the Cloud Foundry thing, right? And it's tied to Cloud Foundry, but that it becomes this API that we all sort of can evolve together and sort of use in lots of different contexts. And being as flexible as a service broker API is, I think that is it's a good extension point for adding support for other things that are similar. That's at least been our feeling as we've experimented and built things with this.
Yeah, so I'm glad that you brought that up too, because this is an important point that I want to socialize in the group. Is that it's very possible to me that the Cloud Foundry, the working group for the Open Service Broker API may wind up making backward incompatible changes so that we'll need to have some ability for the Kubernetes catalog to work both with the V2 Service Broker API and also the new Open Service Broker API. I think that's something that would probably be profitable to keep in mind while we're talking through the use cases, because it frames things in a way that like any particular backend is probably going to be a sibling to other ones. We're not building something that should be designed exclusively to work with one backend API. Is there anything else folks wanted to add about the activities of the working group before we move on? Okay. So at a high level, the two, and I'm not sure if you folks are seeing all my windows or if you're just seeing my browser, but the 2 high-level use cases that are in here, obviously they're incomplete. I tell you what I'm going to do is I will share my my text editor, and we can add to-dos or we can add stubs for additional use cases that need to be written up, and we can just start calling out what's missing.
Yeah, I mean, just to kick it off, I think there's a whole bunch of questions around catalog management that I still would love to figure out how those work. So what's the mechanism for like adding stuff to my catalog? Do I add a broker to do that? How do I get that into my system? Can somebody curate a catalog for a cluster or for an organization? I'm not really sure what the ACL policy is for those, but I can imagine a story where if I'm a part of an enterprise and I have catalogs and I have a catalog for my org, I want to be able to curate that to just the approved set of catalog offerings that people in my organization can use.
Mhm.
And yeah, so I mean, just general stuff around importing stuff from catalogs that exist out there. How do I find the list of service brokers that I can use?
Mhm.
'Cause you had a thing here where it's like, I have that already runs a service broker from a SaaS provider. How do I find that? Is it a manual add step in order to get that? Or is there some sort of Uber list of service brokers
Mhm.
that's a part of the catalog so that I just pick those up automatically?
Okay, I tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to make a new section there that's like SIG meeting. And we can just start with a blank slate. And this is probably better than trying to adapt things into what's here currently, just because there's not much. So I'm going to go ahead and start recording those things. So I think the first one is adding service brokers into the catalog. And Weston, you said
Catalog curation.
Catalog curation. And by curation, I think we have all meant when discussing curation, how do we control visibility of particular services into Kubernetes namespaces? Is that accurate, everybody?
Well, do you want to separate it out from the services that get registered into Kubernetes in general, separate from which services are visible to which namespaces?
Let me answer that by qualifying what I've written there as which services can see which catalog, or I'm sorry, which namespaces can see which catalog services. Does that address your concern, Doug?
Well, it definitely addresses the second part of it. I always thought that some of the curation use cases that were being talked about were they don't even want certain services to pop up at all in the catalog. So it's not a question of turning it off for everybody to see. It's just I don't want them to be populated, period. And maybe that's, you can get the same net result through just access control lists, true.
Yeah.
I wasn't sure whether they wanted to completely block them from being registered.
Okay, I'm gonna just call that out for now as a separate thing. So catalog curation, which broker provided services are globally visible? Does that address the first part of your point, Doug?
Yeah, that's close enough.
Okay. Close enough is my middle name. All right, what else, folks?
We need to add some use cases around the application. What was the word that was used in the PR? Application manager? No. Can't remember the exact word, but the guy deploying the application, his interaction pattern with Kubernetes
Mm-hmm.
to provision and bind services to his application.
Okay, so as a consumer of a service, how do I indicate that I want to consume a particular service? And then as a consumer of a service, how do I indicate that I want to bind to an instance of a service?
Yep, that works.
And so kind of what is the unit of consumption in the sense that what do you, is there a notion of a from? Where are you binding from?
Yeah, so let me see if I can indicate that I understand that by restating it. That sounds to me like, is there a notion of binding to a service instance from multiple namespaces or not? Is that accurate?
Yeah, at one level, yes. The question is the namespace the only thing that can consume services? I guess, is there like, if I have a pod outstanding there, is there any value in being able to say, no, this is actually this pod only is able to go ahead and consume this service.
I see what you mean. Okay, so the first phrase that you used to describe this was really good. Could you repeat that?
No.
I think it was like, what is the unit of binding to a service?
I think I said what is the unit of consumption, but I'm not.
Unit of consumption. Is it a namespace? Is it a pod?
Yeah, it's the granularity of that.
Yeah.
Yep, that's a good one.
Okay. What's next?
A bit tangential, but like, what's the update story? So if I can publish service types into the catalog or catalog offerings, how do consumers ever get notified of updates? Do they even care about that?
Mm-hmm.
Probably not for black box services too much, but just even as a service publisher, how do I have versioning support in catalogs?
Okay, so what is the versioning and update story for a service? Example, what happens when a broker changes the services it provides? Does that capture what you said, Weston?
Yes, I think that's fair.
Okay. So I'll supply the next one. When a user binds to an instance of a service, what does that look like? And specifically, which resources are created in their namespace?
I think an extension to that question would be something also about how do you do things like key rotation with respect to a binding? So if you're creating secrets, how do bindings get updated, in other words?
Okay, so what is the update story for bindings to a service instance? Okay, so summarizing. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no problem. On 8, do we want to talk about multiple bindings to the same service instance and how that functions?
Yeah.
I think, so let me restate that as, is it possible to have multiple bindings to a service instance and under what conditions does it happen? I will say that the reason that I articulated it that way is that over the weekend and today I've been thinking about this problem, and I sort of wonder if service instances should not always be namespaced, and if they're always namespaced, is there even a use case for multiple bindings to the same service?
So the one,
You lose the enterprise if you can't do that.
well, the one use case we've been thinking about is if you have multiple bindings to a database that you might, for example, have, say, like read access only for some section of the database. If you have like an HR database or something like that, that was the one. I'm not really sure that it's not only a made up example, but it's certainly something that when we kind of whiteboarding this, we could certainly see where you might get a couple of bindings to a particular database or set of a different set of tables in the database, and you would use one credential for one part of it. But
So It's possible that databases aren't really the best example for why you might want two things in different namespaces to bind to one common service. Probably the best example for it would be a queuing system of some sort where you have two different applications that need to communicate with each other over a queue. It's imperative that they're bound to the same queue in that case.
So let me say, to expand on my comments that I've just made, is that when I say that I wonder if you need to have multiple bindings to a service, I don't mean that should it be possible, that I'm questioning whether it should be possible for multiple namespaces, as an example, to use the same service. I have no question that that should be possible. But what I wonder is whether it's necessary to for that to be represented in the concepts that we're talking about in a first-class way. So as an example, say that you have you have two namespaces that want to use the same service, and and I may have just talked myself out of this in my head while I've been articulating it, but that happens. Just to complete my thought, say they both want to use the same service. So if they say we're talking about a free tier here, and the broker or the service provider is just backing this free tier with a single instance, is it even really necessary to have a single service instance that the consumers bind against? Or can you just have both of them say they want to use the service and they'll get the same instance? I'm wondering if there's a need to represent service instances in a global way. Does that make sense?
Well, I mean, the interesting thing here, I think, is do you want to limit what somebody can define a service to be? Because you can, through the service broker API today, you could certainly create service instance, always return the same instance, right? If you're truly a singleton multi-tenant service, right, then there could just be one logical service instance, but the pattern would be exactly the same. You say, I want a service instance, and then you bind to that service instance. The fact that it's served by some multi-tenant system in the background is kind of an implementation detail, which is the way I like it from a service implementation standpoint.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I don't know everybody's voice yet. Who raised the concern about the enterprise?
Yeah, that was me, Kent.
Okay. Is there a way that we can account for that in the list of use cases?
Yeah, hold on.
Not to put you on the spot or anything.
I mean, I think we should simply leave it as a question here. How can we accommodate the need for N applications to communicate with the same service?
Okay. Tell you what, why don't I rewrite 10 to be that, because 10's a little prescriptive. So why don't I say that 10 is how does the catalog support multiple consumers of the same service that might exist in, I think this is the same instance of a service that might exist in separate Kubernetes namespaces. Ken, does that articulate your concern?
Yes, it does.
Okay.
Is that consumers in separate namespaces or service instances in separate namespaces?
I will answer that question by typing multiple consumers in different Kubernetes namespaces of the same instance of a service. Doesn't sound great, but it's probably accurate.
I might add to that that there's a level of control that we might want as well. Like how do I, as a service producer, provider, or in-state operator, control the number of consumers allowed to bind to my instance?
Okay. How do I control the number and identity of consumers allowed to bind to my instance?
Yep,
I think that was Brendan.
Yep.
Okay. Is that accurate, Brendan?
Yeah, that's spot on.
Okay.
And I'd add, I guess, maybe if we don't have it, how do I control the identity of people allowed to instantiate my, maybe that's kind of in the catalog curation.
Yeah, I actually think that 11 on this list is probably covered by 4 and 5. Or I'm sorry. No, I'm wrong. So I think that number 11 is not covered. I think this is another attribute of curation. So let me see if I can rewrite this. Curation. How do I control who can see a service instance that I have provisioned? And then curation, maybe this isn't curation, but how do I control the number of consumers of my service instance?
Yep, and also I think if we take a step back even further, curation, how do I control who can create a service instance of a particular item in the catalog?
Gotcha. I feel like number 4
Is that number?
is what I had in mind for that. Do you think the wording needs to change?
Yeah, that's kind of the opposite side of the relationship. That's as a consumer of a service. I'm thinking more as a operator of the service management system. How do I?
I'm sorry. I think I meant number 3.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Maybe that's
add to it.
That's maybe a little too implementation detail with the namespaces bit. Is namespace the identity?
Yeah.
That's the assumption. Okay, then that's
well, I meant as a acknowledgement that I heard what you said. I do think the namespace is the identity, like the unit of identity. But I'm happy to rewrite this if you feel like it's overly specific.
No, I think that's fine if everybody's operating under that assumption.
Okay. So I think this might be a good time to call out what are the assumptions.
I was just going to say that. Thank you.
So I propose that that we make an assumption that a namespace is the unit of identity for a consumer. Any disagreement?
Can you elaborate on what that implies? Does that mean services are visible to namespaces, or that only namespaces are bound to services? What do you mean by that?
Well, I think that it implies that that we will not make any attempt to subdivide a namespace so that there are some resources within a namespace that can work with a particular catalog service and some that can't.
Okay, in terms of visibility of service, I agree with that.
Visibility of service, use of that service. I think that like the namespace is the smallest atom of identity that we can design for.
So this one basically means that the number 6, then the answer to the question number 6 is namespace.
No.
Okay. What does it mean then?
I think what Paul means on this one is, in terms of catalog visibility, what's the scope of the access control list that we can define? Do I have that right, Paul?
Yeah, I think scope of the ACL is probably a good handle on it. So to elaborate on that, I think that if you have a namespace signifying through however mechanism we decide upon that it wants to use a service, then any pod in that namespace can use that service however we decide that should be done.
But it doesn't stop you from having multiple consumers of the same type of service inside the namespace, each with their own different binding. Is that correct?
I'm parsing that right now. So,
I think the answer has to be yes, and I think that goes to number 6, which is what is the unit of consumption? Because if the unit of consumption is a namespace, then I think it precludes the use case you're just talking about, Dan. If the unit of consumption can be down to the pod level, then I think it allows what you're talking about.
Yeah, so I'm inclined to agree with Doug. And let me say then that I'll recast this as the assumption is the unit of consumption of a service is a namespace.
Does that mean that?
Whoa. Did you mean the unit of consumption or the unit of authentication?
The unit of consumption, and by that I mean the thing that makes a claim or a binding to a service instance is a namespace, not a pod.
Yeah, I would disagree with that.
Yeah.
I agree that I agree that namespace is the unit of visibility to the catalog, but I'm not sure I would go as far as to say that it's the unit of binding or whatever I can't remember the phrase you used.
So can you elaborate on why you disagree on that aspect?
Because I may want to bind just one particular pod to a service, but not necessarily have all applications that are running in that namespace have access to the service.
So let's talk about what having access means. Can you say what that means to you in this context?
So let's say I choose to expose the credentials to a service through environment variables. I would expect those environment variables, the equivalent of the VCAP services thing, to be set only within one particular pod. I would not expect it to be set in every single pod in my namespace.
Okay, so I think that might be, if we want to constrain that further, then I think that will take some work. And I suggest that so the reason is that what I expect is that we'll probably expose an actual service, Kubernetes service, into a namespace when you make a binding on it. And there is no way to prevent, if you have a service instance, there's no way to prevent right now a pod from having environment variables to use that service, because the environment variables are generated automatically for every pod. There's environment variables, Docker link style environment variables generated for each service in the namespace.
Yeah, personally, I feel like that's going too far. That the unit of consumption, one of the things that we did with the steward thing is we said, all right, here is a rally point. This rally point is a secret, or potentially a service binding, an instance of a service binding thing that you can get a handle on and consume and mount it into your application however you like, rather than having all of that stuff automatically sort of reified in the pod's environment. I like the explicit aspect of like, here's a thing, here's a rally point, write your credentials or, set of Kubernetes resources that were instantiated as the result of some service invocation, rather than, dropping a service and screwing up all the pod's environments.
So from the access control, or quote unquote, being able to go ahead and see those things, to me, that's one part of the equation. The other part also is, how do you reason about the system? So if I have an application that has multiple pods, the ability to go ahead and understand who actually is using services, I think is also very important. And if the only thing that you have visibility into is that, well, there's some stuff in this namespace that uses this service, that's much less meaningful to me.
Okay, so let me call out that there is already a desire in the core API or in in Kubernetes to eliminate those automatic generation of the links and move to an explicit binding between, where we get into overloaded vocabulary, so an explicit dependency on a service in a pod. And what that looks like is that instead of being automatically injected with all the environment variables for every service in your namespace, that a pod author would say, I want this pod to use this service, and that is the item that controls the injection. So my personal thinking has been that that is something that this SIG could do in the core to facilitate aligning service use with specific pods. With that idea having escaped the Pandora's box of my brain, does it get more palatable to say that the unit of consumption is a namespace in the sense of like a coarse grained consumption? This namespace can use this service, but within that namespace, the pods that actually use it need to have something in the pod spec, or perhaps more likely an annotation initially that says this pod needs to use this service. Give it the things that that it needs to use the service.
Yeah, I think that gets much closer to what I think would be usable. Namely, one of them which is, hey, I just want these credentials to be available in this namespace, where you assume that that namespace is cooperating, aka friendly.
Mm-hmm.
Makes sense. And the second part, which is, hey, I really want to go and understand the relationships. Who is taking this service? And as long as there's an explicit mechanism for saying, yes, this pod or these pods use this service, to me, that seems like a very desirable feature of the system.
Okay.
And then I think that what you're saying is that the way it would surface would be something like, hey, I have 7 pods running in namespace. 2 of these need access to service X. Now you declare the intent using the core mechanism.
Yeah. Doug, I see that you've raised your hand.
Yeah, and this could be based upon my newness to Kubernetes, but let me ask sort of possibly a very dumb question. Why does the namespace need to be involved at all at the consumption level? What would be wrong with simply saying, for each pod that you want, connect up, create a binding for it, and then put whatever annotations you want inside the pod spec? Why does the namespace have to be involved in the picture?
So the namespace needs to be involved, I think, so that you know the subject that or you know the target namespace that consumes the thing, so that you can make resources in that namespace, and that you have a longer lived subject than a particular pod. Because pods may go away, right? Like say that if you're using deployments, a pod isn't a good subject to own the consumption of a service, because your pod will go away when the deployment is, when you have a new version of your application to deploy.
Well, yeah, but I could also then just say the binding is the life cycle of the binding is the same as the pod, and so I get a new binding each time it gets redeployed. As a worst case scenario, I'm not saying necessarily would, but I'm just trying to understand. I kind of understand that the service instance might have to be bound to a namespace. I'm not completely sold on that yet, but I can kind of buy that. But I'm not quite sure I understand why the binding has to be at the namespace level.
Okay, so let's separate out. I think there are 2 different concerns that are floating around right now. One is, can a namespace, absent any particular resources, deployments, pet sets, pods, can a namespace use a service? And then within that namespace, what particular resources are using that service? Is that an accurate way to frame things?
That might be a good discussion to have. Yes, I agree.
But I think I also, Doug, if I understood you, you basically made a point about lifecycle as well. So I'm not sure, which is if you do create a, like what does the lifecycle look like? Because if it is bound to a namespace, then having bindings come and go might be trickier, right? But if these cover your cases, that's fine. I just want to make sure that doesn't get lost.
Yeah, in some ways, I mean, it seems like we are, we went off from requirements and use cases, and now we are limiting things based on what we believe a rational implementation is going to be.
Okay.
I guess it's fine in some ways, but I think it's also important to try to decide what is the ideal services model that we want to put in place. And if there's something that Kubernetes doesn't do, if there's some capability it does not have, then maybe we should bump that question up and ask the Uber Kubernetes people about, could we make this work in some other way?
Yeah. So let me just call out. We have about 5 minutes left here. So I'm gonna avoid writing down any assumptions. We can spend the rest of the time talking through this thread.
But I think Martin, I'd like to capture Martin's point there, as I think it was Martin. Basically, I think the higher order question he was asking there is, what can actually be bound to a service? Is it just a pod? Is it the generic notion of an application? Is it a namespace? Is it something else? I think answering that question might help answer some of my questions.
I think there's also the the question of whether binding needs to be decomposed into multiple parts. And if you think about how this works for applications without the service broker, you would create a service and maybe a config map or secret in your namespace, and then you would explicitly reference at least the secret or config map in your pod, and ideally the service as well, so we could get rid of the default environment variables for services that get set up. So there's an explicit linkage between the pod and the secrets and service, and the secret and service themselves are an instantiation of a binding in some sense. So that's decomposed into two pieces. And I think we'll likely have something similar with bindings to things to service instances as well, especially if we go with something like the claim model. You'll have a claim that will import something into your namespace, and authentication and whatever is another issue as well. And then there needs to be likely some kind of explicit reference to the claim to indicate that you're actually consuming that binding from the pods and all the different forms that pods can get created, arbitrary controllers and whatnot. Whether we inject the degree to which information is automatically injected into containers is yet another issue, and I think there are different trade-offs in that space that we want to explore.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. As usual, Brian has articulated it much better than I have. But I feel as though I was making a feeble attempt to describe what Brian just did.
So I think, number 6, the unit of consumption is not sufficiently clear to have a productive conversation about that. And I think the whole monitoring aspects, like how do you reason about the system, that's yet another issue which doesn't necessarily need to be conflated with the other things I mentioned.
Do you have a suggestion for a more productive way to recast number 6, Brian?
Not off the top of my head. I think we'll have to break it down into at least 3 or 4 different items. Where is that thing that you're typing up anyway?
This is just in my local instance, and what I'm going to do is I will make a pull request, adding it to the document in the incubator repo.
Okay, I can just comment on that if you CC me.
Okay, so I'll put Brian to comment. So we are at the end of the hour, and as someone who respects everybody's time, I would like to end the meeting here. But I think this was a really great discussion, and so I wonder what is the appetite of the group to meet tomorrow to continue to discuss these things. We haven't decided on takeaways yet. How do people feel about like a half hour tomorrow for folks to volunteer to write up particular use cases?
Just the time. Let's see what people think.
Yeah, sounds good to me.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yep.
I got it.
All right. Dan W., I see that you have made a comment in the chat. Why don't you raise this question tomorrow when we talk? And I will make a pull request to the incubator repo to get this onto the internet. Doug suggests that we meet at the same time tomorrow. That sounds great to me. If anybody has a conflict, please speak now or forever hold your peace, as the saying goes.
Yeah, works for me. This would be like.
Okay. Cool. So I'll see you all tomorrow, same time, same back channel. Thanks everybody for the good meeting today. Talk to you later.
Thanks. Bye.